It was a calm early morning in a small suburban town, the kind of morning where the sun barely peeks over the rooftops, and the streets are quiet except for the occasional car passing by. The air had that crisp, almost fresh feeling that makes people take a deep breath and just enjoy the moment before the day's chaos begins. On this particular morning, a pair of local police officers were driving their patrol car down a winding road, lined with neatly trimmed trees and houses that all seemed to look alike. They were alert, focused, just doing what they did every day, making sure the neighborhood felt safe. They were on a routine patrol, something they did countless times before. But on this day, something unusual caught their eyes. A sleek, dark-colored sedan was driving slowly ahead of them, moving a little differently than the usual cars. It wasn't speeding, but it didn't quite match the rhythm of the quiet neighborhood morning. The officers exchanged a glance, the silent communication they had developed over months on the force. One of them murmured, "Something feels off." The other nodded. It wasn't unusual for them to investigate something that seemed out of place. After all, keeping the town safe meant noticing things others might overlook. They turned on the flashing lights and slowly pulled the sedan over to the side of the road. The car slowed and came to a smooth stop on the shoulder, the driver's hands visible on the steering wheel. The officers approached cautiously but professionally, keeping in mind that most encounters like this were simple traffic stops. They didn't know at that moment that the day was about to take a turn they would never forget. The driver rolled down the window with a polite smile. His demeanor was calm, almost unusually calm for someone being stopped by the police. He greeted the officers with a simple, "Good morning," and handed over his driver's license and registration without hesitation. The officers took the documents, glancing at them carefully. Everything seemed normal at first glance, the name, the license, the registration. But something about the driver seemed different. There was an air of confidence that didn't come from arrogance but from experience, from someone used to being noticed, even respected. As the officers studied the license and registration, they noticed the driver's name and title. One of them hesitated, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He leaned in slightly to double-check. The other officer noticed the hesitation and asked, "Is everything okay?" The first officer's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. I think we might have stopped the wrong person," he said. There was a pause, a silence that made the air feel heavier. The driver noticed the change in their tone and raised an eyebrow, curiosity replacing his calm smile. "The wrong person?" he asked politely. He wasn't defensive, and there was no hint of frustration in his voice. He seemed genuinely interested in what was happening. The officers exchanged another glance, unsure of how to proceed. One of them finally spoke. "Sir, your identification. It says you're a member of Congress. You write the paychecks for our department." For a moment, the driver didn't say anything. He just smiled, a mix of amusement and understanding in his eyes. He wasn't angry, didn't raise his voice, and didn't make any demands. Instead, he leaned slightly out of the window and said with a gentle tone, "Well, that's quite a coincidence, isn't it?" The officers couldn't help but notice how composed he was. They had expected tension, perhaps irritation, maybe even anger, but there was none of that. Just calm, polite curiosity, the kind of demeanor that comes from someone used to dealing with people in all kinds of situations. The officers felt a sudden wave of embarrassment. They had pulled over someone who held a position of authority over them, someone who could influence their careers. Their training told them to treat every person the same, to follow the rules, but in that moment, they couldn't ignore the human aspect of the situation. The realization that they were dealing with someone important, someone they probably shouldn't have stopped, yet someone completely calm about it. The conversation turned slightly awkward as they tried to verify the identification once more. One officer held the license carefully, scanning the details while the other glanced around, almost hoping no one else was watching. The neighborhood was quiet, but there was always the possibility that a passerby could notice, and that added to their unease. They asked a few standard questions, the kind they would ask any driver during a traffic stop, but everything seemed routine, almost mundane. And yet the stakes felt unusually high. Meanwhile, the congressman, still smiling, answered each question with patience. He didn't rush them, didn't sigh, didn't show even a hint of irritation. He seemed to understand that mistakes happen, that the officers were just doing their job. He even made a small joke about how life was full of surprises, and how sometimes the people responsible for rules end up in unexpected situations. The officers chuckled nervously, grateful for the lightness he brought into the moment. It eased some of the tension that had built up in the past few minutes. As the officers continued their routine checks, they began to realize that the encounter would be one of those stories they would remember for the rest of their careers. It wasn't just about a simple traffic stop anymore. It was about the unpredictability of life, the human side of authority, and the fact that anyone, even a congressman, could end up in an ordinary situation. They couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and awe. Relief that the situation didn't escalate, and awe at the composure and kindness of the person they had stopped. After what felt like an eternity but was really only a few minutes, the officers finally finished their verification. They handed back the license and registration, their faces slightly red from embarrassment but also showing respect. One of them spoke first. "Sir, we're very sorry for the mistake. We didn't realize who we were stopping until just now." The congressman waved his hand lightly as if brushing off the apology. "No harm done," he said. "It's an honest mistake. I know you're just doing your job." There was a pause, a moment where all three of them seemed to just stand there, taking in the situation. The officers were grateful for the grace and patience he had shown. They had expected tension, but instead they had found understanding and kindness. The congressman's demeanor reminded them that even in positions of power, one could remain humble and approachable. It was a rare moment, a reminder of the humanity that often gets lost in the daily grind of life. Finally, the congressman started his car again, the engine purring softly. He gave a small wave to the officers and merged back into the quiet morning traffic. The officers watched him go, still trying to process what had just happened. They sat in their patrol car for a few moments, exchanging glances that said more than words ever could. They had experienced a story that would be told and retold, a story of surprise, humility, and respect, all in a matter of minutes on a quiet suburban street. As the morning continued, life returned to its usual rhythm. Birds chirped in the trees, the sun climbed higher in the sky, and the quiet streets remained calm. But for those two officers, nothing would feel quite ordinary again. They had learned something valuable, that mistakes happen, that authority is human, and that sometimes, the people you least expect to encounter in everyday situations can leave a lasting impression. It was the start of a day that would be remembered, not just as a routine patrol but as a moment where life reminded them of its unpredictability. And though they would continue their work, making stops, writing reports, and ensuring safety, this one stop, this simple traffic stop, would always stand out in their memories. A quiet morning, a mistaken stop, and a congressman who reminded them that patience, humor, and understanding can turn even the most awkward situations into moments of connection and respect. The congressman had barely disappeared around the corner when the two officers finally exhaled, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over them. They stayed in their patrol car for a few moments, staring out at the quiet street, the incident still sinking in. One of them shook his head slowly, muttering under his breath, "I can't believe we just stopped him. The guy literally signs our paychecks." The other officer just laughed nervously, a little embarrassed, a little amused. "Well," he said, "at least he didn't yell at us or make a big scene." The calmness and politeness of the congressman were still echoing in their minds. Most people would have been annoyed, maybe even angry after being stopped for no reason. But he had handled it with grace, humor, and patience. It was almost as if he understood the position of the officers and knew that mistakes happen, even to the best-trained professionals. That simple kindness and understanding made the officers realize how much they had underestimated the human side of authority. They drove slowly back onto the main road, their minds racing. Every detail of the stop kept replaying in their heads. The polite smile, the calm explanation, the small joke about life's unpredictability. The encounter had been brief, but it felt like a life lesson wrapped in a few minutes of ordinary street activity. They couldn't help but think about how different it could have been if the congressman had reacted with anger or frustration. In that case, the morning could have turned into a public relations nightmare for them. One officer spoke first, breaking the silence. "You know," he said, "I've stopped plenty of people in my career and I've never felt this off. Like this wasn't just a normal stop. It felt different." The other nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it wasn't just about doing our job. There was something about him, He didn't make us feel small or powerless, even though technically we were in the wrong. As they continued their patrol, they talked about how rare it is to meet someone in power who is still approachable, humble, and genuinely human. People often think that those in high positions forget what it's like to be ordinary, to deal with everyday challenges, but this congressman had shown them otherwise. It wasn't just his words or polite tone. It was the way he carried himself calmly, without ego, without pressure. He had treated them like people, not as tools, not as subordinates, not as obstacles. The officers couldn't help but reflect on their own lives as well. How often do they or anyone make snap judgments based on appearances or assumptions? Here was someone in a position of authority, a person who could influence their careers, yet he didn't use that power to intimidate or belittle them. Instead, he showed patience and understanding, qualities that are rare in any field, let alone in politics. They also thought about the impact of that morning on their perspective. Most days are filled with routine tasks, traffic stops, paperwork, and responding to calls. The job can sometimes feel repetitive, even stressful, and it's easy to forget the human element in all of it. But today had reminded them that even small encounters can carry big lessons. A few minutes on a quiet street had taught them about humility, empathy, and the power of calmness. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, their laughter slowly returning as they tried to shake off the lingering tension. They joked about how future patrols would probably feel boring in comparison to this one, and how they might start double-checking names more carefully next time. After the morning's unexpected encounter, the two officers returned to their regular duties, but it quickly became clear that the incident wasn't going to fade from their minds anytime soon. Every call they responded to, every car they pulled over seemed to remind them of what had happened. It wasn't just a traffic stop anymore, it had become a moment they couldn't quite process. Both officers felt a mix of pride, embarrassment, and even a little anxiety. They had handled the situation as best as they could, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they had just experienced something rare, almost surreal. As the day went on, the officers found themselves thinking about the weight of their responsibilities. On one hand, they were trained to treat every person the same way, to follow procedure, and to ensure safety above all else. On the other hand, they had just realized that a simple mistake could involve someone whose decisions directly affected their careers and livelihoods. It was a strange, almost dizzying realization. One of the officers muttered quietly, "It's weird. We're supposed to protect everyone equally, but today it felt like we were suddenly tiny in a very big world." The other nodded, staring out the windshield at the passing neighborhood, feeling a similar sense of disorientation. Their minds drifted back to the stop itself. The calm, patient way the congressman had handled the situation kept replaying over and over. It was almost like a movie in their heads. The polite greeting, the small smile, the way he had answered their questions without a hint of irritation. They kept asking themselves what they would have done differently if he had reacted angrily, or if he had tried to make them feel powerless. The thought made both of them shiver slightly. As they continued their patrol, they also began to notice the reactions of the community. Even in a small town, word spreads quickly. People who had been outside that morning had seen the flash of the patrol lights, maybe even caught a glimpse of the congressman's car. While no one knew exactly what had happened, speculation ran quietly in the background. The officers realized that their actions, even a small mistake, could ripple out in unexpected ways. They weren't just patrolling the streets anymore. They were part of a story that might be retold in casual conversations, maybe even online. The more they thought about it, the more they recognized a delicate balance. Officers must act decisively in their duties, but they also had to acknowledge that mistakes happen and that human beings are unpredictable. In this case, the unpredictability had worked in their favor. The congressman had reacted with understanding, but it was a reminder that authority comes with responsibility, and responsibility comes with consequences. The officers felt the weight of that truth pressing down on them like never before. During their lunch break, the conversation naturally turned back to the morning's events. One officer shook his head and said, "I keep thinking about how he didn't make us feel small. Most people would have yelled or demanded respect, but he didn't. That's something I'll never forget." The other officer smiled almost ruefully. "Ish, I mean, we still pulled him over. Can you imagine if it had gone differently? we'd probably be having a very different kind of story to tell." They both laughed softly, though the laughter was mixed with a lingering tension, the realization that they had been lucky. Even as the day continued, minor doubts crept in. What if they had missed something important in the verification process? What if, by some administrative error, they had broken protocol? They reviewed the steps they had taken, checking their memories against each other. Everything had been done correctly once they realized the mistake. But the thought of having pulled over someone so powerful without realizing it in time left them uneasy. They were still human, after all, and humans carry the weight of guilt and second-guessing even when no harm is done. At the next morning, the two officers arrived at the station with a mixture of curiosity and lingering unease. Though the traffic stop was technically over, its impact lingered. Every glance at the files on their desks, every phone call from dispatch reminded them that the day before had been anything but ordinary. The previous morning's encounter with the congressman had left a quiet mark, not just in their memories, but in the way they now approached their work. The atmosphere in the station was calm, a slow hum of routine activity, but the officers could feel the subtle attention of colleagues. Word travels fast in small towns, and even in larger departments, unusual stories often have a way of making the rounds. Their peers were curious, some joking about the VIP stop of the century, others genuinely interested in how it had unfolded. The officers couldn't help but grin at the gentle teasing, but underneath it all, they were still processing what had happened. One of the officers leaned back in his chair, recalling the moment when he had first recognized the congressman. That split second, that pause, had been surreal. The recognition, followed by the realization of their mistake, had created a tension that felt heavier than most confrontations. Yet despite the seriousness of the moment, the congressman's reaction had been unexpectedly human. Calm, polite, patient. He had treated them with respect even when the circumstances suggested he could have done otherwise. It was a lesson in humility they hadn't anticipated. As they shared the story with their colleagues, they focused not on the mistake itself, but on the congressman's demeanor. They described his calm smile, his gentle humor, and the patience he had shown. "He didn't make us feel stupid," one officer said quietly. "Most people would have, especially someone with his authority." The other nodded. "Exactly. That's what stuck with me, the way he handled it without making it a big deal. It turned a mistake into a learning moment." The conversation reminded them that authority isn't just about enforcing rules or holding power. It's about how people respond when mistakes happen, when expectations clash with reality, and when everyday life throws surprises at them. The congressman had understood that, and in doing so, he had left a lasting impression on the officers. They realized that their work, as structured and rule-bound as it could be, was always about people first. Later that day, the officers returned to the streets, their patrol car moving slowly through familiar neighborhoods. Every car they passed seemed different now. Each driver had a story, each passenger a life beyond the windshield. The morning traffic stop had shifted their perspective, reminding them that routine encounters carried weight, even if it wasn't immediately visible. They found themselves more patient, more observant, and more mindful of the small gestures that could make a big difference. Even the simplest interactions now felt richer. A polite greeting, a calm tone, a small smile. These were tools that could transform an ordinary day into something meaningful. The congressman's behavior had shown them that human decency often matters more than authority, more than rules, and more than titles. That insight would guide them not just in their work, but in the way they approached people every day. By afternoon, word of the stop had quietly reached the higher-ups. The officers were surprised when their supervisor asked them to provide a brief report, not as a reprimand, but as a way to document the unusual encounter. They carefully wrote down what had happened, emphasizing the professionalism and patience of the congressman rather than the mistake itself. It was a reminder that the story wasn't about embarrassment. It was about how one person's calm and human approach could turn a routine incident into a lesson for others. When the report was submitted, the officers felt a small sense of closure, though the memory of the morning lingered like a gentle echo. They knew the story would be shared, perhaps repeated in casual conversations and laughter around the station, but they also understood its deeper significance. It wasn't just a funny anecdote, It was a reminder of why they had chosen this work in the first place. Protecting the community wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about connecting with people, understanding them, and showing respect even when mistakes happen. As the evening approached, the station began to quiet down. The day had passed, with no extraordinary incidents, yet the officers couldn't help but reflect on the surreal start. That morning had been a reminder that life has a way of surprising people, of teaching lessons in unexpected ways. Even someone with immense authority, who could have made a confrontation tense or intimidating, had instead shown patience, understanding, and humor. That choice had transformed an ordinary stop into a story worth remembering. On the drive home, the officers shared a quiet conversation, reflecting on how much the event had changed their outlook. "You know," one said, "I feel like we'll never look at a routine stop the same way again." The other nodded. "Yeah. It's like a reminder that every person behind the wheel has a story, and that how we treat them matters as much as the rules we enforce." They were tired, yes, but there was also a sense of growth. A single encounter had shifted their perspective in ways they hadn't expected. That night, as the town settled into quiet darkness, the officers replayed the morning in their minds. They remembered the calm voice, the polite words, the gentle humor, and the way the Congressman had treated them not as subordinates or mistakes, but as people doing their best in a complex world. It was a rare lesson in patience, humility, and respect, one they would carry long after the details faded. Over the next few days, the incident became a quiet legend among the patrol teams. Colleagues would smile knowingly when it was mentioned, sharing a subtle nod of understanding. While it was retold with light humor, everyone acknowledged the deeper message. Authority and respect are not just about rules and titles. They are about how humans interact with each other, how patience can transform mistakes into lessons, and how kindness can make even an ordinary moment memorable. For the officers, the story also sparked reflection on their own lives outside the force. They thought about their interactions with family, friends, and strangers. Could they approach people with the same calm patience, the same understanding that the Congressman had shown them? It was a challenge they welcomed, knowing that life often tests people in small, quiet ways that don't always make the news. The story, simple as it seemed, became a touchstone for them. Every time they patrolled a familiar street or responded to a minor call, they remembered that quiet morning. It reminded them that even in positions of power, humility, and understanding matter. That day had been a small miracle of human interaction, a brief moment where patience and respect turned a mistake into a lasting lesson. And so, life at the station carried on, with its usual rhythms and calls. But for those two officers, the morning stop remained a defining moment. It was a story they would retell for years, not to boast, but to remember the power of calmness, the importance of empathy, and the rare beauty of a human connection that defied expectations. That one unexpected morning had transformed their outlook, teaching them that even routine work could contain extraordinary lessons. They learned to appreciate the small gestures, the patient words, and the quiet understanding that often goes unnoticed, but can leave a lasting impact. For them, it wasn't just a story about a mistaken traffic stop. It was a story about life, humanity, and the subtle ways in which people can teach each other without ever intending to. Days turned into weeks, but the memory of that morning never left the two officers. Life at the station returned to its usual rhythm, routine calls, paperwork, traffic patrols. But the lesson of that traffic stop lingered. Each time they approached a car, each time they interacted with someone, they carried with them a new awareness. It wasn't just about following rules anymore. It was about seeing the person in front of them, understanding their world, and approaching every interaction with patience and respect. The Congressman's calm demeanor had left a lasting impression. Even though they had only spoken to him for a few minutes, the way he had handled the situation felt monumental. It reminded them that power isn't just in titles or authority. It's in the choices people make, the patience they show, and the kindness they extend. It was a simple concept, yet seeing it in action had a profound effect. The officers began to notice small changes in themselves. They listened more carefully, spoke more gently, and approached each situation with an open mind. Their colleagues noticed it too, subtle shifts in tone and attitude that made the station environment calmer and more supportive. It was as if that single encounter had quietly transformed not just their perspective, but the way they approached the people around them. Occasionally, someone would ask them about the story. Their colleagues would joke about the VIP stop, or tease them about stopping someone so important by mistake. The officers would laugh, but they also shared the deeper lesson. They talked about patience, empathy, and the quiet power of treating others with dignity. What had started as an embarrassing error had become a story of learning, growth, and human connection. Even outside the station, the lesson carried over into their personal lives. They treated family, friends, and strangers with the same calm understanding that the Congressman had shown them. They realized that life is full of moments that test patience, humility, and grace, and how people respond can make all the difference. A small gesture of respect could turn an ordinary day into a memorable one, just as it had done for them on that quiet street weeks ago. One afternoon, the two officers found themselves back near the location of the original stop. The street was calm, the sun casting long shadows across the pavement. They shared a quiet smile, remembering that morning. "Hard to believe it all started here," one said. "Yeah," the other replied. "Just a few minutes changed the way we see everything." The realization wasn't just about that one encounter. It was about life itself, about the unexpected lessons that come when people meet with patience and humanity. The story became part of their shared history, a reference point whenever new recruits joined the station. It wasn't just told as a funny anecdote, but as a teaching moment, a way to remind others that even in positions of authority, it's possible to act with grace. The officers had learned that every interaction, no matter how small, has the potential to leave a lasting impact, both on themselves and on others. Looking back, the incident was more than just a traffic stop. It was a moment of human connection, a reminder that empathy and respect are more powerful than authority alone. It showed them that mistakes don't have to be disastrous. They can become opportunities to learn, reflect, and grow. The Congressman's patience had turned what could have been an embarrassing situation into a story of inspiration. As the years went by, the officers continued their work, but the lesson stayed with them. It shaped how they approached the community, how they treated colleagues, and even how they lived their personal lives. They realized that life often presents challenges and surprises in small packages, and it's the way people respond that defines the outcome. A simple act of patience, a gentle word, or a calm approach can ripple out in ways that are impossible to measure. Finally, one of the officers said quietly, as they walked out of the station one evening, "I think that morning will stay with us forever." The other nodded, smiling. "It already has. Not just the story, but what it taught us about being human." They looked at each other, both understanding the unspoken truth, that the most memorable lessons often come from unexpected places, and that life's small moments can carry the deepest wisdom. The Congressman never returned to that quiet street for another stop, but his impact remained. It wasn't about politics or position, it was about humanity. The officers knew that whenever they faced challenges, mistakes, or tense situations, they could draw on the memory of that morning. They could remember the calm, polite, patient figure who had turned a simple traffic stop into a lesson in grace. And so, the story ended not with fanfare or recognition, but with quiet reflection. It was a reminder that life is unpredictable, people are human, and every interaction carries the potential for learning. Mistakes, when met with understanding and empathy, can become moments of growth. Patience and kindness are powerful tools, capable of transforming ordinary encounters into lasting memories. The officers went home that evening, the sun setting behind the station, feeling a sense of gratitude and insight. A simple mistake had led to an extraordinary lesson. They had learned about patience, humility, and the human side of authority. They had learned that respect isn't demanded, it's earned even through the smallest gestures. And most importantly, they had learned that even a brief moment, like a traffic stop on a quiet street, could leave an imprint that lasts a lifetime. The officers couldn't ignore the lesson the Congressman had imparted, almost without trying. Patience, calmness, understanding, qualities that seem simple but are so rare, had turned what could have been a tense, uncomfortable confrontation into a moment of mutual respect. It made them think about the relationships between those who enforce the law and those who create it. There's a natural tension there, a dynamic built on rules, authority, and accountability, but today it had been softened by empathy and human kindness. Later in the afternoon, the officers were called to another routine stop, and though the situation was unrelated, they approached it with a new perspective. Every interaction, they realized, is more than just a procedure. It's a human moment. The morning's event had reminded them that even people in positions of power are human, and that every encounter carries the potential for learning, understanding, or even connection. They approached this new call with more patience, more attention, more awareness, remembering how small gestures, politeness, calmness, understanding can change everything. By the time their shift ended, the officers returned to the station feeling exhausted but thoughtful. They shared the story with a few colleagues who listened with amusement, disbelief, and gentle teasing. But beneath the humor, everyone understood that it was a meaningful lesson. Authority, responsibility, human error, humility. It was all there in one short, unexpected encounter. Even the smallest mistakes can leave a lasting impact, depending on how people respond. As they signed off for the day, the two officers couldn't help but reflect on how much they had learned in such a short span of time. Life has a way of presenting lessons in unexpected packages, and today's lesson had come wrapped in the form of a quiet, calm, and extraordinarily patient congressman. They realized that their jobs were about more than rules and enforcement. They were about navigating the unpredictability of human behavior, showing patience and finding understanding where it might not be expected. The incident would stay with them for a long time. Whenever they patrolled the same streets, whenever they pulled over another car, or even when they simply shared a coffee during a break, they would remember the morning when a routine stop turned into a memorable lesson about human decency, patience, and grace. The congressman had left without fanfare, but his presence, his words, and his demeanor had left an impression that neither officer would ever forget. It wasn't just a story about a mistake. It was a story about how people can turn ordinary moments into extraordinary lessons. The officers had learned something invaluable. Authority and respect are not just about titles, rules, or power. They are about the way people treat one another when mistakes happen, when expectations clash with reality, and when human decency is tested. And so, the day ended with a quiet satisfaction, a new sense of awareness, and the understanding that sometimes the most important lessons come from moments we least expect. It was a day that began like any other, with the sun rising over quiet streets, but it would be remembered as a day when a simple traffic stop became a profound reminder of humanity, patience, and grace in the most surprising of circumstances. But underlying the humor was a shared sense of gratitude. They had witnessed firsthand how grace under pressure could turn an awkward, potentially tense situation into something memorable, even inspiring. Back in the congressman's world, he returned to his morning routine still calm and composed. He was aware of the small stir his stop had caused, but he didn't dwell on it. For him, it was a reminder that life is unpredictable, and sometimes even routine activities can turn into teachable moments. The story of the stop would likely circulate quietly among the officers and, eventually, make its way into casual conversations. But for him, it was just one of those little surprises life occasionally offers. Meanwhile, the officers continued their patrol, now more alert but in a different way. They were more aware of the human element in every encounter, remembering that every person on the other side of a traffic stop has a story, a life, and sometimes surprising patience. They felt a renewed sense of purpose in their work, understanding that authority and respect are a two-way street, built on understanding and kindness as much as rules and regulations. As the day went on, the story of the mistaken stop became a quiet anecdote in the department. Colleagues teased them gently, asking if they had really stopped the congressman. Even though it was a source of light-hearted jokes, the officers carried a deeper lesson with them: the importance of patience, humility, and remembering that everyone, regardless of title or power, is human. The day continued, filled with its usual calls and routine checks, but the morning encounter had left a mark. It was a story they would tell again and again, not just for the humor of stopping someone so powerful by mistake, but for the reminder it gave them about human nature. Life has a way of surprising us, showing us lessons in the most unexpected places, and today, a simple traffic stop had done just that. By evening, the officers were back at the station, sharing the story with fellow colleagues. There was laughter, disbelief, and the occasional playful jab about how careful they would have to be in the future. But underneath it all was respect, not just for the congressman, but for the reminder that every encounter, no matter how small, carries a lesson if one is willing to see it. And so, the morning that began like any other became a story of humility, patience, and unexpected connection. A quiet street, a routine patrol, and a man who could have let his position intimidate others instead chose kindness and understanding. For the officers, it was a day they would never forget. A reminder that human decency can transform even the most awkward situations into something memorable, meaningful, and even inspiring.